Days Gone was far from a perfect game, but in the 2 years since its launch, it's become quite the underappreciated gem with a devout following of fans. The game is also set to be coming to PC sometime this spring, which may have made you think the series has a future. In actuality, it looks like the game may just be a one-off, as Sony reportedly rejected a pitch for a sequel back in 2019. That's according to a new article by Bloomberg's Jason Schreier, who spoke with inside sources about the matter. In the article, Schreier characterizes this as Sony's obsession with blockbuster titles, and it is causing unrest. Supposedly, developer Sony Bend pitched the sequel back in 2019 but was rejected by Sony due to the mixed critical reception and lengthy development time, despite the more positive reception the game has acquired over time and decent commercial sales. The game currently sits at 71 on Metacritic and was widely criticized for things like repetitive gameplay, poor pacing, and vast performance issues. While I still really like the game, these issues are hard to refute and clearly stained the game in Sony's eyes, but most of the performance issues were able to be fixed post-launch. On top of that, the game still got some bullshit criticism from a few corners of game journalism for things like having a gruff white male protagonist. On top of the loyal fanbase, the game was actually commercially successful and made money, but clearly that's not good enough for Sony. If it isn't a total home run hit like Horizon or God of War, it sounds like Sony doesn't really care all that much. Another one of those hits is The Last of Us, and Sony has so much faith in it as a franchise that the first game came out, and then it got a remaster, and then it got a sequel, and now supposedly a remake is in the works too. This remake was in development with a new studio codenamed T1X, but Sony was reluctant to give it a budget or even fully acknowledge the game's existence, leading some involved to question Sony's intentions and commitment. That studio eventually lost the project and it was handed back to Naughty Dog, the original developer of the IP, while half of Sony Bend supported Naughty Dog in development of a multiplayer game, presumably Last of Us related. The other half of Bend were put to work on a new Uncharted project, said to be a reboot of sorts, but studio leadership requested to be removed from the project due to fears of losing autonomy and being absorbed into Naughty Dog. At least that's according to Schreier's reporting. The Last of Us remake was considered a safe option and would all but guarantee a decent profit with far less work and an expense than an entirely new game. Initially, the idea was to remake the original Uncharted game, but due to its age, it was considered too difficult, so the easier and safer bet of The Last of Us was chosen. PlayStation's new head of Worldwide Studios, Herman Hulst, formerly the head of Guerrilla Games, apparently wasn't a fan of the remake project because it was just too expensive. Development of the remake was stalled before it even got off the ground, as the team was drafted in to support the final stages of development on The Last of Us 2. Once that game launched, Naughty Dog staff were then moved to help with the remake, but it quickly became clear who was really in charge. Frustrated at losing control to Naughty Dog, key leadership of T1X began to fall away, and the studio's future remains unclear, and the existence of the studio still remains publicly unconfirmed. It seems possible that it will be absorbed into Naughty Dog itself, something which Bend was very afraid of, and is even jokingly referred to as Naughty Dog South, while Bend is Naughty Dog North. And it isn't just the US teams that are having trouble, as Sony's Japan office saw restructuring recently, which led to more staff leaving who worked on popular but lesser known titles like Gravity Rush and Everybody's Golf. Sony is so desperate to be a hit factory that it told developers that it has no time for smaller titles that only sell well in Japan. This article was published on Friday, but the situation around Days Gone has been evolving somewhat over the weekend. In a huge 4-hour podcast with David Jaffe, Days Gone director Jeff Ross elaborated a little on some of the details and discusses Schreier's article. Jeff Ross and John Garvin were game director and creative director respectively, and neither of them are at Sony Bend anymore due in some part to Sony's finagling. David Jaffe is also a former Sony employee who worked on titles like Twisted Metal and directed the original God of War. Altogether, Ross is very careful with his words and acknowledges that he is still under an NDA, so he is limited on what he can and can't say. Ross doesn't outright confirm or deny the state of Days Gone 2, but it is worth noting that while he was a very senior member of staff on the game, he is no longer at the studio and currently works at NetherRealm. Therefore, some of his insights may not entirely be accurate to the state things are in now, but it's certainly interesting to hear his perspective. In a tweet following the podcast, Ross said, "Thanks to everyone who attended the podcast with Jaffe. I wish I could have been more forthright with some questions. Just remember, Jason Schreier is a journalist who takes his craft seriously, and he has the luxury of being able to be more honest than I'm allowed." Whether Schreier's report is entirely accurate is up for debate, but clearly at least some part of it holds true. Ross even points out that Days Gone sold more units than anything else the studio has ever made, combined, so clearly the game was a financial success. He mentions that Sony made its name with big budget single player titles and that most of them make a lot of money, but it's still nothing compared to a game like Fortnite with recurrent consumer spending. Despite that, and despite Schreier's criticism of Sony's blockbuster approach, Ross is still very appreciative of Sony and commends the company for being a very supportive and hands-off developer. developer. One of the most interesting tidbits Ross touched on was that the original Days Gone was meant to be a co-op game, and that idea fell off during the early stages of development, but that would have been folded into the sequel somehow. Days Gone 2 would have had you run your own clubhouse and deconforming his own biker gang, which sounds amazing, and I'm getting serious Red Dead Redemption 2 vibes with the camp. All in all, Days Gone 2 almost certainly isn't happening right now, but is definitely not completely dead. The first game was a good commercial success and found a loyal fanbase, but early reviews and a long development cycle soured Sony on the idea of a sequel. It's unfortunate because not only was the game pretty good, especially after some bug fixes and performance patches, but it also had a real cliffhanger ending that remains unsolved. In terms of Bend becoming a support studio for Naughty Dog, Ross denied that that was ever the case during his time there, but perhaps things have changed since his departure. Towards the end of the podcast, Ross says, "I think that the article is true based on the sources. That means that the sources are accurate, but that is just one interpretation of the situation and may not tell the full story or be as extreme as Schreier suggests." Days Gone is still due for release at some point this spring on PC through Steam, and I'm really excited to play it again at unlocked frame rates and higher resolution. Being able to face off against the Sawmill Horde at over 100 frames per second sounds like an absolute dream. For me, one of the most frustrating things about not getting Days Gone 2 is the news that we're getting a Last of Us remake instead. The first game only came out in 2013, so that's really not that long ago, but then the remaster for PS4 launched the following year. That remaster is outstanding and still holds up to this day, so why the hell does it need a remake? Plus, one of my biggest issues of The Last of Us 2 is how it does very little to improve on the gameplay of the original. If you want updated gameplay to the original, just play part 2, it's basically the same, just tighter and sharper, so why do we need another one? Maybe Days Gone 2 will find some form of life at some point, but at least for now, it doesn't look like it's happening, and with both Jeff Ross and John Garvin no longer working at the studio, whatever that game is would probably be entirely different from the original pitch anyway. Regardless, the studio is still at work on something, supposedly a new IP, and I'm very interested to see what they get up to. Hopefully the PC release will breathe a little more life into Days Gone so we can see it at some point in the future, maybe, please. Anyway, that's it for this video. It's gone on for long enough. Please like, subscribe, and support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/prettygoodgaming. I've been Henry Cooper. Bye for now.